March 1940. Stratford, Connecticut. Inside a hangar that smelled of oil, aluminum, and ambition, a small team of engineers at Chance Vought Aircraft gathered around a machine that looked unlike any fighter ever built. Its wings bent downward, then sharply up again in a shape that defied reason. Its nose, long and predatory, housed the most powerful aircraft engine in the world, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. On paper, it promised to make the new fighter the fastest propeller-driven aircraft on Earth. In reality, it would create both legend and nightmare. Rex Beisel, the chief engineer, ran his fingers along the curved cowling, as if touching a living thing. He had demanded performance no Navy fighter had ever achieved. 400 miles per hour, climbed to 20,000 feet in 7 minutes, range of 1,000 miles. To meet those demands, he had accepted compromises that would soon kill men by the hundreds. The enormous engine needed an equally enormous propeller, 13 feet in diameter. To clear it, the plane's landing gear had to be longer than any carrier fighters in history. Straight wings couldn't hold such gear, so Beisel invented a strange inverted gull shape to shorten the struts. The result was aerodynamic brilliance and mechanical peril. On May 29, 1940, the prototype F4U took to the air for the first time, piloted by Lyman Bullard. The takeoff roll was smooth, the climb effortless. Moments later, the Corsair screamed past the airfield at 405 miles per hour, the first U.S. naval fighter to break that barrier. The crowd erupted. A new era of naval aviation had begun. But when Bullard returned to land, the triumph turned to dread. The cockpit's nose sat so high that he could barely see the runway. He flared too late. The Corsair slammed onto its gear, bounced once, then collapsed in a shriek of metal. Bullard survived. The aircraft did not. The engineers called it a structural test. The mechanics whispered another word: Widowmaker. For the next 2 years, the Corsair evolved through dozens of modifications. Armor added, wings reinforced, landing gear strengthened. Yet one problem refused to die: visibility. The massive engine and long nose blocked forward view so completely that even experienced pilots could not see the carrier deck during approach. On land bases, this meant bent wings and bruised egos. At sea, it meant death. When the Navy's test board reviewed the first carrier trials in 1942, the results were catastrophic. Of 8 landing attempts aboard USS Sangamon, 5 ended in crashes. The Corsair's bouncing landing gear caused wild rebounds. Its right wing stalled first, dropping the plane into the deck like a hammer. The board's verdict was brutal: unsuitable for carrier operations. The aircraft intended to rule the Pacific was banished from the very ships it was built to protect. But America was desperate. The Pacific War had already begun. Pilots were dying in outdated Wildcats against faster, more agile Japanese Zeros. The Corsair's speed, its claws of .650 caliber machine guns, its promise of victory, all were too great to abandon. The Navy turned to the Marine Corps. "Let the Marines take it," one admiral said. "They fly from dirt, not decks." The Marines accepted. They had no choice. At North Island, California, the first squadron of young pilots assembled before their new mounts. Their commander, Major William Millington, addressed them without ceremony. "She's fast, she's mean, and she'll kill you if you don't respect her. This airplane doesn't forgive mistakes, but if you learn her, she'll keep you alive." The men laughed nervously. Few would laugh again. On a bright February morning in 1943, Marine pilot John "Red" Halley took off for his first training flight in the F4U. The takeoff nearly tore the control stick from his hands. Torque from the massive engine pulled hard left. He fought it, climbing into the blue above San Diego. For 30 minutes, he practiced turns and rolls, exhilarated by the power under his command. Then came the landing. He lined up, cut throttle, and watched the world vanish behind the nose. He tried to guess the runway's position by memory. Too high. He corrected. Too late. The Corsair struck the ground, skidded sideways, and erupted in flame. Halley never climbed out. By the end of the month, 12 pilots were dead, none from enemy fire. The aircraft that promised air superiority had become a machine that demanded blood before it could earn respect. Engineers kept redesigning, pilots kept dying, and yet the orders kept coming. Production expanded at Goodyear and Brewster. Thousands of new Corsairs rolling off assembly lines, each painted dark navy blue and carrying the hopes of a nation at war. The newspapers called it America's finest fighter. The men who flew it called it something else: the Ensign Eliminator. In training fields across California, the pattern repeated: first flight, exhilaration, disaster. Each crash was investigated, each report ending with the same phrase: pilot error. But quietly, engineers and flight instructors began to understand. The Corsair was not a forgiving airplane. It was a weapon designed for perfection and intolerant of anything less. By 1943, the Pacific was hungry for fighters. The Corsair would go, ready or not. The machine had proven it could dominate the air. Now the question was whether its pilots could survive it. As the first squadrons prepared for combat deployment, the legend of the bent-wing bird began. So did the body count. The most advanced naval fighter in the world had been born, and it was already feeding on its own. February 12, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The airstrip was little more than scorched coral and mud, bordered by wrecked planes and the rusting skeletons of trucks. It had been built by Japanese engineers, captured by U.S. Marines, and defended through 6 months of blood. Now it was home to a new arrival, a fighter unlike anything the Pacific had yet seen. The first squadron of F4U Corsairs, Marine Fighting Squadron 124, had crossed half the ocean to reach this battered strip of earth. The men stepped from their transport planes into air that smelled of rot, oil, and jungle. They had trained for months in California, wrestling the Corsair's torque, its unpredictable stalls, its blind approaches. But now, they would learn the real test: combat against the Imperial Japanese Navy's best. Captain Kenneth Walsh, a stocky pilot with the calm eyes of a man who had already survived more than most, watched mechanics ready his new aircraft. The Corsair looked monstrous, even among other fighters. Long nose, wide wings, a predator crouched on the tarmac. Its paint gleamed a deep, oily blue. Stenciled beneath the cockpit canopy was its name: Whistling Death. The name came from the sound it made in a dive, a rising shriek caused by the air rushing over its wing root intakes. The Japanese would soon learn to fear that sound, but for the men who flew it, the name carried darker irony. That morning, the first combat patrol lifted off from Henderson Field. The engines roared, scattering palm fronds and dust. 6 Corsairs rose into the sky, led by Walsh. Their mission was simple: intercept incoming bombers sighted north of the island. But as they climbed through 12,000 feet, the aircraft's true nature revealed itself. The Corsair's massive engine torque pulled left. The controls fought against the pilot's grip. The visibility forward was nearly zero. Pilots had to weave their aircraft in shallow S-turns to see where they were going. The Marines called it the dance of survival. Then came the enemy, a formation of A6M0s, sunlight flashing off their silver wings. The two groups sighted each other almost simultaneously. Walsh rolled hard and dove, the Corsair's speed building in seconds. The Japanese pilots, trained in agility and patience, tried to climb into position for a turning fight. It was their last mistake. The Corsair was faster by 70 miles per hour. Its 650 caliber gun spat fire, tearing through the thin aluminum of the lead Zero. Walsh's round struck the cockpit, the plane bursting into flame and spiraling toward the sea. Another Zero broke off, climbing vertically. Walsh followed, pressing his advantage. At 8,000 feet, he pulled the trigger again. The tracers walked up the Zero's fuselage. It disintegrated mid-air. The battle lasted 4 minutes. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, 1 Corsair damaged. It was a victory, but not a clean one. On the return flight, Lieutenant Ralph Spaulding's Corsair began to shake violently. Oil pressure dropped to 0. He managed to glide toward Henderson Field, but on final approach, the engine seized completely. With the nose blocking his view, Spaulding misjudged his descent. The Corsair struck the ground at 120 knots, bounced once, then cartwheeled into a palm grove. The explosion echoed for miles. Spaulding's death didn't make the after-action report. It was noted in a single line: aircraft failed to complete landing due to mechanical failure. The pilots knew better. The Corsair had claimed another life. In the following weeks, VMF 124 continued flying combat sorties. Their kill count rose, so did their casualties. The fighter could outclimb, outdive, and outgun anything the Japanese sent against it. But every victory seemed to demand payment. Pilots crashed on takeoff when their landing gear collapsed. Others died when their planes flipped during landings, the heavy nose bearing into coral. On March 5th, the squadron lost 3 men in one day, none to enemy fire. 1 aircraft's fuel line ruptured during a dive, igniting mid-air. Another pilot's oxygen system failed at altitude. A third, attempting to land in crosswind, lost sight of the strip and pancaked into a revetment. The mechanics salvaged what they could. By sunset, the air smelled of burnt rubber and grief. Yet the Corsair's combat record was undeniable. In just 2 months, it had destroyed more than 100 Japanese aircraft. The pilots began to respect the monster that devoured their friends. "You don't fly the Corsair," Walsh wrote in his diary. You ride it. You hang on and pray it likes you that day. Back in the United States, Navy officials studied the reports with unease. The statistics told a paradox. The Corsair was the deadliest Allied fighter in the Pacific, and also the deadliest to its own pilots. The Navy had rejected it for carrier use, but the Marines were proving its worth. The question was how many lives it would cost to master it. By June 1943, the Corsair had earned its legend. The Japanese called it Whistling Death. The Marines called it Old Hog. But in letters home, the men gave it another name, The Last Ride. At sunset, after each mission, the survivors would gather outside their tents and watch the Pacific horizon burn red. Some planes never returned, their smoke trailing thinly against the clouds. The mechanics would leave an empty place in the line of aircraft, silent acknowledgement of another lost man. The Pacific sky belonged to the Corsair now, but it came at a cost that grew with every dawn. The machine had proven its dominance. The price was 3,000 lives waiting to be paid. August 1943, Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. The Marines called it the Graveyard of the Pacific, though officially it was a rear area airbase. Hundreds of planes were parked under palm fronds or lined along coral strips, engines quiet, wings scarred. Each aircraft carried stories written in bullet holes and oil stains, some triumphant, many tragic. At the far edge of the field, mechanics worked through the humid night, trying to repair what pilots called the Widowmaker. The F4U Corsair had already earned its reputation in combat, but the majority of its victims were not Japanese. The pattern was so consistent that the Navy quietly issued internal warnings. Exercise extreme caution during carrier qualification, unforgiving aircraft. Among pilots, the phrase translated simply, if you make one mistake, it kills you. The problem was physics. The Corsair's massive radial engine generated enormous torque, twisting the airframe left during takeoff. Its wings, though beautifully efficient at high speed, behaved unpredictably at low speed. The right wing stalled first, rolling the aircraft violently into the ground. The landing gear, tall and narrow, bounced like springs when striking the deck. Combined with the pilot's near-total lack of forward vision, the result was carnage. At Espiritu Santo, Captain Frank O'Neill, a former stunt pilot from Kansas, was tasked with training new arrivals. His job was simple on paper: teach them to take off, land, and stay alive long enough to reach the front. In practice, it was a ritual of attrition. The first day, he gathered his men under the wing of a Corsair and spoke without bravado. This plane doesn't care who you are or what you did before. It doesn't love you, and it doesn't forgive you. You treat her right, she'll bring you home. You get sloppy, she'll dig your grave for you. The men nodded, half listening. Most were 20, barely out of flight school. The Corsair looked magnificent, sleek, predatory, a machine that seemed to promise immortality. Within a week, 2 of them were dead. Lieutenant Harold Buddy Klein crashed on his second landing attempt. The plane bounced, drifted left, and flipped onto its back, trapping him inside as fuel ignited. His crew chief wept as the fire crews arrived too late. 3 days later, Ensign Paul Rogers misjudged altitude during approach, shearing the tops off palm trees before cartwheeling into the lagoon. The aircraft vanished beneath the surface before anyone reached it. O'Neill filed his reports. Pilot error, the paperwork said. But every night, he would sit in the dim light of the officer's tent, staring at the logbook, wondering how much of it was really their fault. The Corsair demanded precision beyond human capacity. A mistake measured in inches could kill a man outright. In Washington, engineers at Chance Vought tried to tame the beast. They modified the landing gear, adjusted the wing flaps, lengthened the tailwheel strut. Each fix helped a little, but the fundamental flaws remained. The Navy began exploring new solutions, one of them radical. Goodyear would build a land-based version for the Marines, while Vought refined the carrier model. It was a race between production and perfection, and the war would not wait. By autumn 1943, the Corsair was flying from makeshift runways across the Solomon Islands. The terrain was brutal. Coral dust clogged intakes, heat warped ammunition belts, salt air corroded everything. Pilots described taking off with one eye on the sky and the other on their instruments, praying the engine would hold together for the next hour. She's like a wild horse, one Marine said. Kick her too hard, she throws you. Hold her too soft, she rolls right over you. The aircraft's temperament became legend. Squadrons gave their planes nicknames: Death Trap, Widow's Kiss, Bad Medicine. Mechanics painted shark teeth on the nose, lightning bolts on the tail, as if to ward off whatever curse haunted the machine. But they also loved it. In a way, only warriors could love something that might kill them. Combat reports from Bougainville and New Georgia revealed the duality perfectly. On one mission, a Corsair flight intercepted a formation of Zeros at 15,000 feet, destroying 8 without loss. On another, 3 planes disappeared into the ocean after takeoff. No enemy fire, no radio calls, just gone. Captain O'Neill survived his first tour, but returned a changed man. He spoke little, chain-smoked constantly, and refused to fly after dark. In his diary, later found in an abandoned locker, he wrote, "The Corsair is alive. You can feel it breathe. When you climb into the cockpit, it watches you. It knows if you're afraid." The nickname Bent Wing Widowmaker spread across the Pacific like a curse. Even Navy recruiters began hearing it whispered by new cadets. Some pilots refused Corsair assignments altogether, preferring the slower but predictable Hellcat. Others sought it out deliberately, as if daring death to try them. Those who mastered it were revered. Men like Kenneth Walsh, Gregory Pappy Boyington, and Robert Bob Hansen, aces who turned the Widowmaker into a weapon of myth. But the statistics never lied. For every ace who survived, 10 never came home. Between 1943 and 1945, nearly half of all Corsair losses occurred during takeoff or landing. More than 3,000 pilots died without ever seeing the enemy. By late 1943, even Japanese intelligence reports noted the pattern. A captured document from Rabaul described American fighters of great speed but much danger to their own pilots. The enemy understood what the Americans would not admit publicly. The greatest threat to a Corsair pilot was his own airplane. Yet despite the death toll, production increased. The U.S. military needed results, not excuses. As the Pacific War intensified, so did the urgency to deploy every available fighter. The Corsair remained both a marvel and a menace, the pinnacle of piston engine design, and a machine that demanded human sacrifice to prove its supremacy. Each dawn at Espiritu Santo began the same way. Engines coughing to life, mechanics shouting, the smell of aviation fuel thick in the air. Pilots climbed into cockpits streaked with dust and oil, some glancing briefly at the photographs taped to their dashboards. Wives, children, the faces of people who would never understand what these men faced each time they took off. At dusk, the airfield grew quiet. Maintenance crews counted the returning aircraft. Some never came back. Their names were written in the log, their bunks stripped clean by sunset. Another entry, another statistic, another ghost for the Widowmaker. November 1943, Bridgeport, Connecticut. Inside the brick walls of the Chance Vought plant, the smell of machine oil hung heavy in the winter air. Thousands of workers, men too old for the draft, women with scarves tied around their hair, moved between assembly lines that hummed like living arteries. The Corsair, the most complex fighter America had ever built, consumed everything: aluminum, copper, rubber, sweat, and time. In an office overlooking the production floor, Rex Beisel leaned over blueprints covered in red pencil marks. The engineers called it Version D, the next attempt to cure the Corsair's lethal temper. Beside him, test pilot Boone Guyton stood silent, his flight jacket still streaked with frost from a morning test flight. "She's faster than ever," Guyton said finally, "but she still wants to kill her pilot when he comes home." Beisel rubbed his temples. "The Navy wants a carrier fighter. They don't care about our excuses." He knew the problem wasn't lack of intelligence or effort, it was physics. The Corsair's long nose and massive propeller had forced compromises that no amount of engineering elegance could completely erase. The wing's inverted gull shape reduced drag, but created complex airflow near the root. The landing gear, retracted into those same curves, twisted under stress. Every improvement solved one flaw and created another. Guyton had survived dozens of crashes testing those fixes. He was one of the few who truly understood what the Corsair demanded. "It's not the plane's fault," he said. "It's ours. We built her to be perfect in the air, not gentle on the ground." Across the country, other mines were fighting the same battle. At Goodyear's plant in Akron, Ohio, engineers worked under license to build Corsairs for the Marines. They modified the landing gear shock absorbers, reinforced the tail, and added new dampers to reduce bounce. Each change required thousands of pages of redesigns, retooling, and retraining. The production lines never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The sound of rivet guns echoed through the night. The pressure was immense. Navy inspectors demanded daily reports. Bureau of Aeronautics officers toured factories with clipboards and cold eyes. Each delay was another day without fighters in the Pacific. The war was moving faster than the engineers could think. Inside the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, the same institution that had birthed the proximity fuse, scientists studied the Corsair's aerodynamics. They built scale models, tested them in wind tunnels, traced vortices with smoke. The results were damning. At high angles of attack, the low-speed, high-drag regime of landing, the right wing stalled before the left, causing a violent roll. Fixing it required recontouring the leading edge. Simple, the scientists wrote. In practice, it meant redesigning the entire wing and halting production, impossible in wartime. So Basil and his team improvised. They added a small metal strip to the leading edge of the starboard wing, forcing it to generate more lift and delay stall. They adjusted the flaps to create asymmetric airflow. In December 1943, Guyton tested the modification over Long Island Sound. The difference was immediate. She still kicks, he reported, but she warns you first. It wasn't perfection, but it was survival. Meanwhile, on the far side of the world, the Marines reaped the benefits. Reports from Bougainville showed fewer landing accidents. Pilots who once cursed the plane now trusted it, a little. The improvements worked, but the losses continued. For every technical fix, the Pacific claimed more lives. In January 1944, Vought engineers were summoned to Washington for a classified meeting with Navy Command. The subject, carrier operations. The Hellcat, built by Grumman, had become the Navy's workhorse, slower than the Corsair, but far safer to land. Admirals demanded to know why Vaught's fighters still killed so many pilots. Basil faced the panel alone. "Gentlemen," he began, "the Corsair is not a training aircraft. It's a weapon. It demands discipline." One admiral leaned forward. "Discipline doesn't stop a plane from bouncing off a deck." Baisel's temper flared. "Neither does cowardice, sir. This machine wins battles. If you want safe, buy gliders." The room fell silent. Days later, the Navy authorized further carrier testing. The tests were brutal. At Patuxent River, Maryland, Navy pilot Lieutenant Charles Brown made 8 landing attempts aboard the USS Bunker Hill. The first 6 ended in near disasters: bounces, wing drops, hook skips. On the 7th, the right gear collapsed. Brown walked away with a broken arm. The 8th attempt, flown by another pilot, succeeded. The Corsair had finally landed safely on a carrier. That single success changed everything. The Navy reversed its ban. The Corsair was approved for carrier duty. Production orders tripled overnight. Back in Bridgeport, the news swept through the factory like gospel. Workers cheered, unaware that each celebration meant more pilots would soon face the Widowmaker at sea. Basil stood in the hangar doorway, watching rows of freshly painted aircraft glint beneath the winter sun. "We built her to win the war," he said quietly. "I just hope she doesn't run out of pilots first." In a nearby laboratory, young draftsman Helen O'Reilly recorded production figures. 96 aircraft per week, 12,000 by year's end. She didn't know that her brother, a Marine pilot stationed at Roy Namur, would die in one of them 3 months later, killed not by Zeros, but by a failed hydraulic line during landing. The engineers' war was fought not with bullets, but with slide rules and sleepless nights. Every drawing change, every rivet adjustment, carried the weight of a life somewhere over the Pacific. The Corsair's perfection lay just out of reach, and the men chasing it could never rest. By spring 1944, the Widowmaker was ready for its next chapter, a return to the sea it had once been denied. The Navy's blue decks waited, and the Pacific waited with them. The engineers had done all they could. Now the pilots would pay the rest of the price. April 1944. Vladivostok, Soviet Far East. Along the frozen docks of the Golden Horn Bay, a small convoy of American cargo ships lay moored under gray skies. Their decks were stacked with wooden crates stenciled in English and Russian. Aviation components, Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union, though officially focused on the Eastern Front, quietly studied every piece of Western machinery it received. In a hangar on the edge of the bay, under the watch of both NKVD officers and aircraft engineers, a disassembled F4U Corsair stood on wooden trestles, its blue paint dull in the cold light. Captain Ivan M. Kovalenko, test pilot for the Soviet Air Force's Research Institute, circled the alien machine. He had flown everything from Yakovlev fighters to captured Messerschmitts, but he had never seen a plane like this. The wings bent like a bird mid-dive, and the massive propeller looked absurd beside the short landing gear. The Corsair had arrived as part of a limited evaluation shipment, its crate marked for scientific purposes. Officially, the Soviets were only to study its engine and armament. Unofficially, they intended to learn its secrets. The Americans called it the fastest naval fighter in the world. Yet the reports reaching Moscow told a darker story, of hundreds of accidents, of pilots killed in training, of a machine that turned against its own. The Soviet engineers, pragmatic and unsentimental, approached it as they did every Western import: dismantle it, measure it, understand it. In the drafty hangar, Senior engineer Anatoly Semyonovich noted the airframe's balance and structure. "They sacrificed everything for speed," he muttered. "Look at this fuselage. Long, thin, almost no tolerance for error. This isn't a machine for men. It's for heroes." His assistant, a young woman named Zinaida Volkova, recorded his notes on a clipboard. She had studied American engineering journals smuggled through diplomatic channels. "They build for perfection," she said. "We build for survival." Kovalenko climbed into the cockpit. The canopy closed with a metallic click, sealing him inside a cramped bubble of instruments labeled in an unfamiliar language. The forward view was nearly non-existent. "You could hide a tractor in front of this engine and never see it," he said through the intercom. "No wonder they crash." The Soviets ran tests over the next weeks. On April 23rd, Kovalenko took off from a frozen runway near Artyom. The double Wasp engine roared to life, its torque pulling sharply left, just as the American manuals had warned. At full throttle, the plane leapt forward like a hunted animal. Within seconds, it was airborne, climbing at an angle that shocked even the observers on the ground. At altitude, the Corsair was magnificent, stable, responsive, unstoppable. Kovalenko rolled, dove, and looped, his voice over the radio, alternating between admiration and awe. "She's a killer," he said. "Not of enemies, of the unprepared." Landing was another matter. The long nose hid the runway completely. As he descended, Kovalenko had to lean out of the cockpit, guessing at his approach. The right wing stalled just before touchdown, exactly as the reports predicted. The aircraft bounced, skidded sideways, and tore a tire before settling into the snow. When the engine stopped, the silence felt like a reprieve. His debriefing was precise and merciless. "Exceptional combat performance," he wrote. "Unacceptable ground behavior, designed by mathematicians, not pilots." His words echoed what American aviators were discovering an ocean away. In Moscow, the Air Force Research Institute compiled its findings into a classified report. The Corsair was described as a machine of remarkable power but dangerous temperament, suitable only for highly skilled personnel. It was never adopted for service, but its lessons were not lost. Soviet designers studying the Corsair's wing geometry and control systems drew conclusions that would shape future projects. One engineer noted, "We must never build a plane that kills its own pilot before the enemy can." That phrase would resurface years later during the development of the LA-9 and MiG-3 successors. The Soviets learned from the Corsair's extremes how to channel power without sacrificing control, how to balance aggression with forgiveness. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American squadrons continued to pay for those same lessons in blood. At Espiritu Santo, another Marine pilot died in a landing accident that week. His wingman wrote in his logbook, "She's perfect in the air, murderous on the ground. Maybe the Russians will build something better one day." The irony was cruel. The aircraft that symbolized American engineering genius also embodied its arrogance, the belief that perfection could be achieved at any cost. The Soviets, forged in scarcity and discipline, saw the same machine as a cautionary tale. They admired its power, but distrusted its purity. In the archives of the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, TSAGI, the Corsair's blueprints were filed under Foreign Combat Aircraft, Observation Only. But the engineers who studied it would carry its influence for decades. The rugged landing gear of post-war Soviet fighters, the wide-track designs that allowed pilots to land on frozen runways, the emphasis on stability over sheer speed, all owed a quiet debt to the lessons of that bent-wing American killer. Years later, when the Cold War dawned, some of those same Soviet engineers would see captured photographs of U.S. Navy jets and recognize familiar lines. "The Americans learned too," Semyonovich would say in his old age. "They learned what we all did, that power without mercy is suicide." By the summer of 1944, the Corsair's legend had crossed every ocean, a symbol of brilliance and recklessness. In the Pacific, it roared across island skies like a god of vengeance. In the Soviet Far East, it rested quietly in a hangar, stripped of paint, its secrets measured and catalogued. Two nations, enemies in ideology, but allies in necessity, drawn together by one truth: the sky forgives nothing. June 1944, the Philippine Sea. The dawn sky shimmered with the faint orange of another tropical morning, the sea beneath it as flat as glass. On the deck of the USS Bunker Hill, dozens of F4U Corsairs stood ready, wings folded like sleeping birds. Crewmen swarmed around them, loading ammunition, checking hydraulic lines, wiping salt from canopies already streaked with heat haze. In a few hours, those engines would ignite, and the world above the Pacific would burn. Lieutenant James "Red" Caldwell leaned against his Corsair's landing gear, helmet in hand, listening to the distant rumble of the carrier's engines. He was 23, the veteran of 19 combat missions, and already older than most of the men who followed him. His squadron, VF-84, had been ordered to join what would become the largest air battle in history, the assault on the Japanese fleet moving toward Saipan. The pilots called it simply the Big One. At 0900 hours, the first wave launched. The Corsair's propellers cut the sea air into silver ribbons. Deck officers gave the signal, and one by one, the fighters rolled down the deck and leapt into the blue. Caldwell's heart pounded as he reached full throttle. The nose rose, blocking his view, but his hands moved by instinct. The aircraft clawed skyward, leaving the ship behind like a forgotten world. At altitude, the radio crackled with code words and tension. Radar picked up incoming Japanese formations, bombers and fighters closing fast. The fleet braced itself for the first strike. Below, hundreds of American ships tightened formation, anti-aircraft guns already scanning the horizon. Above them, the Corsairs took position, their dark silhouettes gleaming against the sun. The first enemy wave came at 10:43 a.m. Dozens of Mitsubishi A6M0s escorted Nakajima dive bombers straight toward the carriers. The air filled with chaos, tracer fire, smoke trails, shouts over the radio. Caldwell dove from 18,000 feet, the Corsair screaming as it built speed. He fired a burst into a bomber's wing. It disintegrated in a cloud of black oil and flame. Pulling up, he saw another Zero on his tail, guns flashing. He rolled hard right, the heavy fighter groaning but obeying. The Zero overshot, and Caldwell's reply was merciless, a 2-second burst that tore the enemy to pieces. Below, other Corsairs were not as lucky. Lieutenant Donald Ward's engine seized mid-dive. He tried to bail out, but his canopy jammed. The plane plunged into the sea, exploding on impact. Ensign Paul Kruger collided with debris from a burning bomber. His aircraft vanished in a flash of orange. The air smelled of cordite and salt, the horizon filled with falling metal. The Americans called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. But behind the triumph, another battle unfolded unseen, the one between pilots and their own machines. Of the 80 Corsairs launched that morning, 11 never returned. None were lost to enemy gunfire. Engines overheated, hydraulics failed, landing gear jammed. One pilot, attempting to land on the carrier Lexington, hit the deck too hard. The plane bounced, veered right, and sliced through the safety barriers into parked aircraft. The explosion killed 12 men and destroyed 3 Corsairs in seconds. Caldwell survived, but the memory of that landing haunted him more than combat. "The fight ends when you're home," he wrote in his journal that night. "But with this plane, home is where the killing begins." By August, Corsairs dominated the Pacific skies. Over Guam, Tinian, and Palau, they ripped through Japanese formations with mechanical precision. The fighter had finally achieved what his creators promised, absolute air superiority. But victory had a cost measured in empty bunks and folded flags. At Eniwetak Atoll, a maintenance officer compiled casualty reports. In 3 months of combat, 312 Corsairs destroyed in action, 197 lost in accidents. The numbers looked identical on paper. The Pacific didn't care whether death came from enemy fire or mechanical betrayal. Even the aces felt it. Pappy Boyington, leader of the famed Black Sheep Squadron, wrote from his tent in Bougainville, "The Corsair makes you feel immortal at altitude. On landing, she reminds you you're not." His men revered him, but they watched him closely each time he returned from a mission, his approach erratic, his landings violent. He once joked, "If you can land her twice, you've earned the right to live." The engineers back in Connecticut received daily combat reports, lists of victories, losses, mechanical notes, scrawled by exhausted maintenance chiefs. Each new failure brought another redesign, but the ocean always found new ways to claim its tribute. The tropical heat warped circuits, the salt corroded hydraulic lines, and the sudden storms that rolled in without warning turned landing decks into moving death traps. By late 1944, the Corsair's legend had split in two. To the public, it was America's champion of the skies, whistling death, the scourge of Japan. To the men who flew it, it was both savior and executioner. They spoke of it with the reverent soldiers reserved for gods, powerful, capricious, and cruel. At night, on the flight decks of carriers drifting under Pacific stars, the survivors gathered in silence. Some stared at the horizon, where enemy flares still burned faintly. Others cleaned their weapons, avoiding each other's eyes. The sea breeze carried the faint scent of gasoline and salt, and beneath it, the memory of screams swallowed by engines. In letters home, The pilots tried to make sense of it. One wrote, "Mom, the Corsair's like flying a thunderstorm. It gives you wings, then takes them away when you least expect it." Another, "I think of the men who didn't make it, and I wonder if the plane chooses who lives." The Pacific campaign was far from over. Okinawa waited, and beyond it, the Japanese home islands. The Corsair had proven itself in battle, but it had not yet faced its most terrible test, the storm that would devour ships, planes, and men alike before the war's end. The fires of the Philippine Sea were only the beginning. December 1944, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Beneath the tropical calm of the harbor, where the wrecks of 1941 still slept under coral and silence, a different kind of war unfolded. One fought with statistics, memos, and silence. In a dimly lit office within the Bureau of Aeronautics Liaison Building, Commander William Forsyth stared at a stack of manila folders stamped "Confidential. Operational Losses." The numbers on the first page were unbelievable even to him. F4U Corsair, 3,078 pilots confirmed lost, non-combat. Forsyth rubbed his eyes. "Non-combat," he whispered, as if saying the word too loudly might make it less obscene. Across the table, Lieutenant Commander Ellen Davis, a Navy analyst transferred from the Bureau of Ordnance, studied her own copy. "That's nearly half the total production of trained naval aviators in the Pacific," she said flatly. "That's not a statistic. That's an epidemic." The reports had come from across the fleet, from Bougainville, Tarawa, the Gilberts, the Marianas. The pattern was identical everywhere. Aircraft lost on takeoff, on approach, in training, in transit, on calm days, and in perfect weather. The causes listed were always the same: mechanical malfunction, pilot disorientation, hard landing. None mentioned fear. None mentioned that the Corsair's own design was the executioner. The Bureau wanted silence. "We can't have headlines saying our best fighter is a death trap," one admiral said. "Morale won't survive it. Neither will Congress." So the truth was buried under euphemism. Reports were rewritten, losses diluted among multiple categories. If a pilot's engine seized on landing, it became loss of power. If a gear failed, it became hard deck impact. If a pilot simply vanished into the ocean, no one wrote the word widowmaker, but the pilots knew. They always knew. At Barber's Point Air Station on Oahu, a small group of returning veterans gathered for debriefing. They were gaunt from exhaustion, uniforms sun-bleached, eyes older than their faces. Lieutenant James "Red" Caldwell, back from the Bunker Hill, sat at the end of the table. The officer in charge, Commander Frank Doyle, read the official loss tally aloud. When he reached the number 3,000, no one spoke. Then Caldwell stood. "I watched 6 friends burn alive in planes that weren't shot down," he said quietly. "We call it combat loss because it sounds better, but we're fighting the wrong enemy." Doyle didn't interrupt. He had flown Corsairs too. He knew. The reports began leaking in coded ways, through the letters of widows, through rumors in naval hospitals, through quiet confessions in flight schools. A mechanic from the Essex wrote to his congressman, describing planes that bounce like rubber balls, then explode. His letter was intercepted, filed, and forgotten. A Marine flight instructor at Miramar resigned after losing his 3rd trainee in a week. "I'm not teaching men to fly," he wrote. "I'm teaching them to die slower." Still, the war demanded silence. The Corsair's kill record in the air, nearly 2,000 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, overshadowed the hidden ledger of its own casualties. To the public, the bent-wing fighter was America's avenger, the steel angel of Pacific victory. To those who worked the flight decks, it was a roulette wheel that spun faster with every mission. In January 1945, the Navy commissioned a secret study under the codename Project Safe Deck. Its goal: determine why so many Corsairs crashed without enemy engagement. The panel included engineers, test pilots, and statisticians from Johns Hopkins and MIT. The findings, delivered 3 months later, read like a confession. Primary cause of fatal accidents: inadequate visibility during final approach. Secondary cause: unpredictable stall behavior. Tertiary: gear rebound instability. In the margin, someone had scrawled in pencil, "You can't fix blindness." The study recommended major design revisions: a raised pilot seat, longer tailwheel, redesigned flaps. But it was 1945. The war was entering its final phase. Factories couldn't stop. Carriers couldn't wait. The improvements would come later, after the men had already died. On April 7, 1945, the battle for Okinawa began. The first kamikaze waves hit the fleet like divine fire. The Corsairs rose to meet them, flying through smoke and shrapnel, their engines howling. They performed miracles, shooting down suicide planes before they struck the ships. But when they returned, the old enemy awaited. 10 Corsairs crashed during recovery operations that day. 3 pilots were rescued. The rest sank beneath the waves. That night, aboard the USS Bunker Hill, Caldwell wrote one final letter to his father. "We've beaten the Japanese in the sky, but I'm not sure we'll beat this plane. Every landing feels like gambling with the devil. Some of us win, some don't. The strange part is, I still love her. Maybe that's the real danger." 2 weeks later, Caldwell's Corsair caught a downdraft during approach and struck the sea 200 yards short of the carrier. The recovery crew marked his position with a smoke flare. The ocean closed over it within minutes. His name joined the list, number 3022. When the war ended, the official history made no mention of Project Safedeck or the 3,000 dead who never saw an enemy. The Corsair entered museums, films, and textbooks as a symbol of victory, beautiful, fierce, and clean. The records that told the rest of the story remained sealed for decades. Commander Forsyth's final memorandum, dated September 2, 1945, the day of Japan's surrender, contained only one line. "Victory achieved. Recommend internal review of aircraft safety postponed indefinitely. The public need not know the price." He folded the document, placed it in an envelope marked Archive, Restricted, and walked out into the sunlight where the band was already playing Anchors Aweigh. Ships in the harbor fired their guns in celebration. The sound echoed across the water like thunder, or like wings striking the sea. October 1945, San Diego Naval Air Station. The war was over, but the runways were still busy. A steady drone of engines from returning aircraft, some scarred from combat, others fresh from factories that hadn't yet learned the war had ended. Along the flight line stood rows of F4U Corsairs, their once glorious blue paint dulled by salt and exhaustion. Mechanics worked silently beneath the wings, draining fuel, checking hydraulics, removing spent guns. To the outside world, these were machines of victory. To those who had flown them, they were ghosts with propellers. Lieutenant Commander Richard "Rick" Hanley had come home alive, barely. He'd flown 39 missions from USS Essex, lost 4 wingmen, and survived 3 crash landings. Now, as he watched new recruits practice carrier approaches in peacetime drills, he felt the same tension twist his stomach that he'd carried through every sortie. The war was gone. The fear wasn't. From the control tower, Hanley watched a young pilot on final approach. The Corsair wobbled slightly, nothing alarming, then suddenly dipped its right wing. The tires hit hard, bounced, and the aircraft veered across the deck, its right wing snapping like a matchstick. Flames erupted instantly. The tower crew raced for the fire trucks, but Hanley didn't move. He'd seen it too many times. The explosion was muffled, quick. A column of black smoke rose into the sky. Another training crash. Another name to be typed into the casualty list under accidental non-combat. Later that day, Hanley sat in the officer's lounge with a cup of coffee gone cold. Around him, pilots laughed too loudly, pretending not to notice the empty chair at their table. Someone put on a record, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The music drifted through the haze of cigarette smoke, mingling with the smell of fuel. Ensign Joseph Kerrigan, one of the newer pilots, broke the silence. "Sir, they say the Corsair's cursed," he said with a nervous smile. "Truth to that, or just ghost stories from the old days?" Hanley didn't answer right away. He stared out the window where the twisted remains of the burned plane were still smoldering on the tarmac. "Cursed?" he finally said. "No, she's just honest. She tells you the truth about yourself. Too slow, too rough, too scared. She'll kill you. The only lie is thinking you can tame her." Kerrigan nodded, but didn't understand. Few ever did, until it was too late. Across the country, similar scenes played out. In Pensacola, Miramar, Corpus Christi, flight schools that had trained heroes now became memorials to routine tragedy. Pilots died not in battle, but in demonstration flights, air shows, post-war tests. The Navy called them operational losses. The newspapers barely mentioned them. The nation was tired of death. In early 1946, the Navy convened a closed investigation at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia. Test pilot Lieutenant Charles Porter described the Corsair's landing characteristics before a room full of officers. "You can't see the deck," he said. "You're flying blind for the last 5 seconds. The right wing stalls first, always. When that happens, you're a passenger, not a pilot." One admiral interrupted. "And yet it won the war." Porter looked him in the eye. "Sir, it won the war by killing as many of us as the enemy did." His words went unrecorded. In 1947, the Navy introduced a new variant, the F4U-5. It had a taller cockpit, improved flaps, and a redesigned canopy to fix the fatal blind spot. But by then, the damage was done. The original Corsair had already written its epitaph across the Pacific. The new version arrived too late to save the men who had died learning its lessons. That same year, Hanley left the service. He returned to Iowa, bought a small farm, and never flew again. His logbook ended abruptly with his final entry. September 12, 1945, last flight, landed alive. Yet the ghosts followed him. Some nights he would wake to the sound of engines that weren't there, the rising whine of the double wasp, the sudden silence of flameout, the echo of an explosion across an empty sea. In 1951, when the Korean War reignited the need for fighters, the Corsair returned once more. The same design, older, heavier, but still deadly. This time it fought against Soviet-built MiGs, flying ground attack missions from carriers off the Korean coast. Once again, it proved lethal to the enemy, and sometimes to its pilots. At Wonsan Harbor, Marine Captain Thomas Hudner crash-landed his Corsair in an attempt to save his downed wingman, Jesse Brown, the first black naval aviator. Brown's Corsair had taken a single bullet to the oil line and burst into flames. Hudner's heroic effort earned him the Medal of Honor and reminded the world that even in victory, the aircraft demanded blood. After Korea, the last Corsairs were retired, sold to foreign air forces, or left to rust in hangars. Many were scrapped. Some found their way into museums, restored to pristine condition, polished and gleaming under spotlights. Visitors walked past them, reading plaques that praised their speed, their victories, their role in the Pacific. Few plaques mentioned the pilots who had never made it home. In 1963, the Navy declassified part of the Project Safe Deck report. The press barely noticed. Buried in technical jargon was a single statistic that haunted those who understood it. Fatal non-combat loss rate, 24%. No other American fighter in history had come close. That same year, an old veteran named Richard Hanley visited the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. In the main hall stood a Corsair, dark blue, wings folded, immaculate. Children pressed their faces against the railing, marveling at its size. Hanley stepped closer until he could see his reflection in the polished fuselage. The metal was cold to the touch. He rested his hand on the wingtip and whispered, "You never meant to kill us, did you?" No one heard him. The hangar lights dimmed for closing. Outside, the Florida sky burned orange with sunset, the same color as the flames that had consumed so many men long ago. Somewhere above the Gulf, a faint echo of a radial engine seemed to roll across the air, fading into silence. The war was over. The ghosts were not. Moscow. Inside the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, a group of Soviet engineers gathered around a table scattered with American flight manuals, fragments of fuselage, and black and white photographs taken by intelligence operatives in Korea. The subject of their attention was a familiar silhouette, the bent-wing fighter that had terrified the Pacific a decade earlier. The Americans called it the F4U Corsair. The Soviets called it Zhest Smrti, the sheet of death. Among the engineers was Colonel Engineer Mikhail Kabanov, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War and survivor of dozens of test flights in Yak and Lavochkin prototypes. He ran a finger along one of the photographs showing a Corsair nose down on a frozen Korean runway, its propeller bent like twisted petals. "They still fly these things," he muttered. 10 years, and they still haven't learned." Another engineer, a younger man named Pavel Leonov, disagreed. "No, Comrade Colonel. They've learned. They just accept the price." That price was written in every nation's history, not in medals, but in blood. During the Second World War, Soviet test pilots had faced their own Corsair-like tragedies. The LA-5FN, beloved by aces, could roll and climb like a dream, but killed its pilots in flat spins if handled wrong. The MiG-3 was so unstable at low altitude that more than half of its early production run was lost in accidents. And yet, the Soviet engineers, like their American counterparts, had kept pushing, believing that sacrifice was the currency of progress. The Corsair had merely made that truth visible to the world. Across the ocean, the United States Navy was beginning to understand the same lesson. The secret reports that had once been buried were now guiding a new generation of aircraft, jets that would replace piston engines forever. At the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, engineers studied the fatal flaws of the Corsair and turned them into commandments. Never again should a fighter have blind approaches, narrow landing gear, or unpredictable stalls. Every jet that followed the Panther, the Banshee, the Sabre, carried within its blueprints the ghosts of those 3,000 lost pilots. In one corner of the test hangar stood an old Corsair marked with chalk lines and sensors, its engine gutted, its cockpit wired with instruments. Test pilot Commander James Turner was assigned to fly it one final time, collecting performance data for comparison against early jets. Before takeoff, a young ensign asked him, "Sir, why risk it? We already know what happens when they fail." Turner smiled. "Because if we don't measure the danger, it never ends. Every man who died in this machine deserves to know we learned something from it." The Corsair lifted off one last time over Chesapeake Bay, its engine echoing like thunder from another age. When Turner landed safely 30 minutes later, the tower crew applauded, not for victory, but for closure. The data collected that day would help shape naval aviation's transition into the jet era. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Kabanov's team dissected the same lessons through their own lens. They had recovered wreckage of an American Corsair shot down during the Korean conflict. Its frame melted and blackened, but its secrets intact. "Look at these rivets," Leonov said. "Tight tolerances. They build machines that push the edge of control. We build machines that forgive." Kabanov frowned. "And yet, theirs win wars." The younger man replied, "Only when they have men willing to die for them." That exchange summed up the philosophy dividing East and West, not ideology, but engineering. The Americans pursued perfection through power, the Soviets through endurance. Yet both were haunted by the same realization. Every leap forward demanded human sacrifice. In 1954, a declassified U.S. Navy safety bulletin quietly admitted what wartime commanders had buried. The F4U series exhibited fatal stall and visibility characteristics leading to non-combat attrition, unprecedented in naval aviation history. The memo was not for the press, it was for designers. Attached was a note from Admiral John Hyland, then head of the Bureau of Aeronautics. "No aircraft shall again be fielded that kills its pilot more efficiently than the enemy can." In the same year, Soviet designers at MiG incorporated new canopy designs and tricycle landing gear into the MiG-17, a direct response, though they would never admit it, to studying the Corsair's failures. The age of blind landings was over. The world had learned through death what it refused to learn through caution. For the surviving Corsair pilots, those lessons came too late. Many had moved on to commercial airlines or retired quietly to farms and small towns, carrying their memories like unhealed wounds. Some gathered in veteran reunions, where whiskey loosened the silence. They spoke not of dogfights, but of landings, the sound of wheels hitting the deck, the sickening bounce, the flames. They toasted absent friends with trembling hands. "To the boys who didn't get a second chance," one would say, and glasses would clink softly in the dim light. In 1955, an article appeared in Aviation Quarterly titled "The Price of Progress." It told the story of the Corsair without bitterness, just numbers and names. It estimated that the combined Allied losses to mechanical and handling accidents between 1943 and 1945 exceeded 12,000 aircraft. Of those, 1 in 4 were Corsairs. The author concluded, "Technology does not win wars alone. It must be paid for in courage, and sometimes in ignorance." That line reached both Washington and Moscow. It was quoted in design bureaus, translated into Russian, and pinned to drafting boards beside equations and blueprints. By the end of the decade, both superpowers had built machines that truly flew beyond human limits. But behind every new jet's smooth takeoff lay the memory of the bent-wing fighter that had shown them what happens when brilliance outruns humility. In a sense, the Corsair had done more than fight Japan or Korea. It had forced the world to confront a truth older than war itself, that every technological miracle demands its martyrs. And when the last Corsair was finally retired from service in 1957, its engine silent, its wings folded for the final time, a single line in the Navy's archival summary closed the book on its legacy. Operational lifespan, 14 years. Combat record, unmatched. Human cost, unacceptable. No one could improve upon that epitaph. Pensacola, Florida. The sky was clear and humid, the airfield shimmering in the heat. At the Naval Aviation Museum, preparations were underway for the unveiling of a new exhibit, a fully restored F4U-1D Corsair, the same model that had flown from Bunker Hill, Essex, and Enterprise across the Pacific 25 years earlier. The crowd gathered in silence as a brass band played "Eternal Father, Strong to Save." Among the veterans in the front row sat men who had once flown the machine, now gleaming under spotlights. Older now, hair silvered, shoulders bent, eyes haunted by memories the public would never fully understand. Rear Admiral Harold Hawk Adams, retired, took the podium. He had flown 182 missions during the war and survived 6 crash landings. The microphone hissed softly as he began to speak. "The F4U Corsair," he said, "was the greatest fighter of its time and one of the deadliest ever built, not just to the enemy, but to her own." A murmur went through the crowd. Adams paused, then continued. "We loved her because she gave us victory, and we feared her because she asked for payment in blood." Behind him, the Corsair's folded wings glistened like armor. Children pointed at the massive propeller, marveling at its size. None of them could imagine the sound it made in full power, that deep metallic howl that had once filled the Pacific with death. Among the visitors stood a woman in her 40s, holding a faded photograph of a young pilot in a flight jacket. Her name was Anna Caldwell, daughter of Lieutenant James Red Caldwell, lost off Okinawa in 1945. She had been 3 years old when her father's plane disappeared into the sea. The Navy had sent a telegram, then a folded flag. She'd grown up under the shadow of a name carved into a granite memorial. Now she walked slowly toward the aircraft, running her fingers along the polished wing. "He died flying one of these," she said softly to the curator beside her. The man nodded, unsure what to say. "He didn't die in combat," she continued. "They said it was mechanical failure, but I've read the reports. I know it was the landing, the same landing that killed hundreds of others." Her eyes glistened, but her voice was calm. "It wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's. It was the time they lived in. They were learning how to master the sky, and they paid for every mistake with their lives." In the years since the war, historians had begun to piece together what official reports once hid. The declassification of Project SafeDeck, the post-war engineering studies, and the testimonies of surviving pilots painted a picture both heroic and tragic. The Corsair had been an evolutionary marvel, a weapon so far ahead of its time that it outpaced human adaptation. Its combination of raw power and unforgiving design demanded perfection from its pilots, and perfection, in war or peace, is rare. Statistically, the truth was staggering. Between 1943 and 1945, the Corsair's fatal accident rate per 100,000 flight hours was 64, more than triple that of its Navy stablemate, the F-6F Hellcat. It killed nearly as many pilots in training and carrier operations as the Japanese ever did in combat. Yet without it, victory in the Pacific would have taken longer, costlier, perhaps even impossible. Technology and tragedy, two sides of the same coin. Across the ocean, Soviet aviation museums displayed their own relics: Yakovlevs, Lavochkins, and the early MiGs, aircraft born from the same crucible of sacrifice. Soviet engineers, who had once studied captured Corsairs and their blueprints, quietly acknowledged their debt to the lessons learned by the Americans. A test pilot from Zhukovsky once told a journalist, "Every time we made a safer landing gear or a clearer canopy, somewhere in our notes we wrote, 'Remember the Corsair.'" By the 1970s, the Corsair had faded from memory outside of veteran circles and history books. Its distinctive gull-wing shape became a symbol of a bygone era, the twilight between piston engines and jet power. But for those who had known it, the memories never softened. In 1975, during a small reunion of the Black Sheep Squadron, one of the last surviving aces, Colonel Bob McClurg, raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To the men who flew her," he said, "and to the ones she took." No one added more. Silence filled the room, heavy as the sound of an engine cooling after flight. The Corsair's legacy stretched further than anyone could see at the time. Its design principles, the balance between lift and stability, the aerodynamic corrections learned from its flaws, influenced decades of aircraft engineering. The jet age owed much to its failures. So did the safety systems that became standard across the world. Every emergency ejector seat, every landing aid, every cockpit redesign was, in part, a whisper from the ghosts of those who never returned. When the last airworthy Corsair took flight at an air show in 1982, piloted by a civilian who had spent years restoring it, thousands watched from the stands. The plane roared down the runway, lifted gracefully, and banked into the afternoon light. For a moment, the crowd fell silent, as if time itself had bent with the wings. And somewhere in that noise, beneath the thunder of the propeller, one could almost hear the voices of those who never made it home. Today, only a few dozen Corsairs remain. Their aluminum skins gleam in museums from Washington to Warsaw, silent witnesses to an era when courage and technology walked hand in hand through fire. Plaques speak of speed, victories, innovation. Few speak of the 3,000 names left behind, but history remembers, if quietly. Because the Corsair was more than a fighter plane, it was the embodiment of a generation's will to master the impossible, and the price they paid for doing so. Its pilots didn't just fight the enemy, they fought gravity, physics, and the boundaries of human endurance. Somewhere deep in the Pacific, beneath miles of dark water, rest the broken remains of hundreds of Corsairs, wings folded, propellers silent, cockpits sealed forever. The ocean has claimed them, but their legacy endures in every aircraft that lands safely, every pilot who lives to see another dawn. Their story is not one of machines, but of men, of those who flew too close to perfection and paid for it with their lives. The Corsair taught the world a final truth, that progress, like flight itself, always demands lift, and lift is born from resistance.